She should have been buried with him, my daughter-in-law whispered during the final prayer at my husband's funeral. My grandson let out a quiet laugh, and no one defended me. The shock came when I revealed what the will said. I'm glad to, have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I stood beside Harold's casket, my hands folded over my black purse, watching as strangers approached to pay their respects to my husband of 47 years. The funeral home smelled of lilies and furniture polish, that artificial sweetness that never quite masks the weight of grief hanging in the air. She should be buried with him. The words hit me like a slap. Juniper, my daughter-in-law, had whispered them just loud enough for Lance, my 25-year-old grandson, to hear. He snorted, covering his mouth with his hand as if coughing. But I caught the smirk underneath. I felt my chest tighten, that familiar ache I'd carried for years whenever they thought I wasn't listening. But I was always listening. After 7 decades on this earth, you learn to hear the things people think you're too old or too deaf to catch. My son Robert stood 3 feet away from me, shaking hands with Harold's business associates. He hadn't looked at me once since we'd arrived at the funeral home. When people approached to offer condolences, they spoke to him first, as if I were just another piece of funeral furniture. Harold was such a good man, Mrs. Patterson from down the street said, gripping Robert's hand. Your mother must be devastated. Robert nodded gravely. Yes, it's been very hard on all of us, as if losing Harold affected him the same way it affected me. As if 47 years of marriage could be summed up in a polite phrase about family grief. I watched Juniper adjust Lance's tie, whispering something in his ear that made him nod seriously. She'd been doing that all morning, playing the role of the caring daughter-in-law while shooting glances at me like I was a problem to be solved. The pastor began the final prayer, and I bowed my head, but my mind wasn't on his words about eternal rest and heavenly peace. I was thinking about this morning when I'd overheard Juniper on the phone in the kitchen. We'll have to decide what to do with her, she'd said, stirring her coffee like she was discussing furniture arrangements. She can't live in that big house alone. There are some nice facilities that aren't too expensive. Lance had been eating cereal at the counter. Can I have her room for my gaming setup? It has the best natural light. They'd talked about me for 20 minutes while I stood in the hallway, invisible in my own home. They discussed my future like I was already gone, just another item on their to-do list now that Harold was no longer here to complicate things. The prayer ended, and people began filing past the casket for one last look. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I placed it on Harold's folded hands. He looked peaceful, finally free from the cancer that had stolen him piece by piece over the past year. Goodbye, my love, I whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. Behind me, I heard Juniper's stage whisper to someone. She's taking it pretty hard. We're worried about her living alone. You know how it is with elderly people after they lose their spouse. Elderly people. As if I'd stopped being Marlene and become just another category, another problem for them to manage. Robert appeared beside me, his hand briefly touching my shoulder. Mom, we should head to the cemetery now. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The ride to the cemetery was silent except for Lance playing games on his phone in the back seat. Juniper kept checking her makeup in her compact mirror, as if appearances at a graveside service were her biggest concern. At the cemetery, I stood at the edge of Harold's grave while the pastor spoke about dust returning to dust. The words felt hollow, meaningless. Harold wasn't dust. He was the man who brought me coffee every morning for 47 years. He was the one who held my hand during my mother's funeral, who stayed up all night when Lance was born and Robert was too nervous to function. But as I looked around at the small gathering, I realized that version of Harold existed only in my memory now. To everyone else, he was just Robert's father, Lance's grandfather, the man who'd provided for the family, and left behind responsibilities they'd have to sort through. The service ended, and people began to drift away. Robert was already talking to the funeral director about final arrangements. Juniper was checking her phone, probably planning lunch or her afternoon schedule. I remained at the graveside after everyone else had moved toward their cars. The groundskeepers waited respectfully at a distance, but I knew they were eager to finish their work. "Mrs. Coleman?" Robert called from the parking area. "We need to go." I took one last look at the flowers covering Harold's grave, the carnations, and roses that would wilt in the summer heat. Then I turned and walked toward the car where my family waited, their faces showing nothing but impatience and the mild annoyance of people who had somewhere better to be. What they didn't know, what none of them suspected, was that Harold and I had spent many evenings over the past year discussing exactly this moment. We'd talked about what would happen after he was gone, about how they would treat me, about what they really thought of the woman who'd raised Robert and helped raise Lance. They thought they knew what came next. They thought they understood Harold's will, his wishes, his legacy. They had no idea what he'd really left behind. 3 days after the funeral, we sat in Attorney Morrison's office, the same man who'd handled Harold's business affairs for over 20 years. The leather chairs creaked as we settled in, and I noticed how Juniper had positioned herself closest to Morrison's desk, as if proximity to power might benefit her somehow. Lance sprawled in his chair, still wearing wrinkled clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. He kept checking his phone until Juniper shot him a sharp look that made him reluctantly slide it into his pocket. "Thank you all for coming," Morrison said, adjusting his glasses as he opened a thick manila folder. Harold was very specific about how he wanted this handled. Robert sat up straighter. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened whenever money was discussed. Harold's construction business had done well over the years, and there were properties, investments, savings accounts that would need to be distributed. Morrison cleared his throat and began reading. The legal language was dense, full of whereases and heretofores, but the meaning was clear enough. The house would go to Robert. The business accounts would be transferred to Robert. The rental properties Harold owned would become Robert's responsibility. I listened without reaction, my hands folded in my lap. Juniper was practically glowing, her lips pressed together to keep from smiling too obviously. Lance had perked up, suddenly interested now that dollar amounts were being mentioned. "To my beloved wife Marlene," Morrison continued, "I leave my personal effects, household furnishings, and a monthly allowance of $1,500 to be drawn from the estate for her living expenses. $1,500. After 47 years of marriage, I was being given an allowance like a child who couldn't be trusted with real money." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "That seems reasonable for Mom's needs," he said, as if I weren't sitting right there to speak for myself. Morrison nodded and continued reading, but I'd stopped listening to the specific details. I knew what this version of Harold's will contained because he'd shown it to me months ago, back when he was still healthy enough to walk to the mailbox without getting winded. "What do you think about this?" he'd asked, setting the papers on our kitchen table. I'd read through it carefully, noting how it divided his assets, how it provided for me in the most minimal way possible while ensuring Robert inherited the bulk of everything Harold had worked to build. "It's exactly what they expect," I'd told him. Harold had smiled then, that mischievous grin I'd fallen in love with when we were both 23 years old. Good, let them expect it. Now, watching Morrison fold the papers and begin explaining the next steps, I saw that same expectation playing out exactly as Harold had predicted. Robert was already asking about transferring business accounts. Juniper was practically bouncing in her seat, probably calculating how much the house was worth and what they could do with the rental income. "There are a few formalities to complete," Morrison was saying. "Probate will take some time, but the major assets should transfer without complications." "What about Mom?" Robert asked, finally acknowledging my presence. "The allowance starts right away?" "Of course," Morrison replied. "Mrs. Coleman will be taken care of." Taken care of. Like I was a pet they'd inherited along with the furniture. Lance spoke up for the first time. "Grandma, you'll probably want to start thinking about downsizing, right? That house is pretty big for one person." Juniper nodded enthusiastically. "We've been looking at some lovely senior communities, much more appropriate for someone your age." I met their eyes without flinching. "I'll consider my options." The meeting wrapped up with handshakes and promises to be in touch about paperwork. As we walked to the parking garage, I could hear Juniper and Lance talking behind me. $1,500 a month should cover most places, Juniper was saying. "We'll need to sell some of her furniture, obviously. That dining room set is just taking up space." "Can I get the big TV from the basement?" Lance asked. "We'll see. Your father should get first choice of anything valuable." Robert walked beside me in silence, but I could feel his relief radiating from him like heat. The burden of his inheritance was lighter than he'd feared. He'd gotten the business, the properties, the real wealth, while I'd been relegated to a monthly allowance and whatever charity they felt like showing me. When we reached my car, Robert finally spoke. "Mom, you know we'll take care of you. The allowance might seem small, but it's really quite reasonable for basic expenses." I unlocked my car door and looked at him for a long moment. My son, the boy I'd raised, who I'd taught to ride a bicycle, and helped with homework and worried about during his teenage years when he stayed out too late. "I'm sure it will be fine," I said quietly. He seemed relieved by my acceptance. "Good. And about the house, you really should start thinking about what you want to keep. It's a lot of space for one person." I nodded and got into my car, watching. In my rearview mirror, as the three of them stood in the parking garage, already making plans for my future, Juniper was gesturing animatedly, probably describing the senior community she'd already picked out. Lance was back on his phone, losing interest now that the money talk was over. As I drove home through streets I'd traveled for decades, I thought about Harold's real will, the one locked in our safety deposit box at First National Bank, the one Morrison knew nothing about, the one Harold had prepared during those long evenings when he was too sick to sleep, but too restless to simply lie still. "They think they know everything about me," he'd said one night, propped up against pillows in our bed, his breathing labored but his mind sharp as ever. "They think they know what I've built, what I've saved, what I'm worth." I'd held his hand, feeling how thin it had become, how fragile. "What do you want to do about it?" His grip had tightened slightly. "I want to show them exactly how wrong they've been about both of us." Now, pulling into the driveway of the house Robert thought he owned, I felt a strange sense of calm. Tomorrow, I would take Harold's real will to Morrison's office. Tomorrow, I would watch their faces when they learned the truth about what Harold had really left behind and who he'd really trusted to handle his legacy. But tonight, I would sit in my kitchen and remember my husband's smile when he'd signed his name to the document that would change everything. I called Morrison's office the next morning while Robert was at work and Juniper was at her yoga class. His secretary seemed surprised to hear from me so soon after the reading, but she scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. I arrived early, carrying Harold's leather briefcase that had sat untouched in our closet for months. Morrison looked curious as I settled into the same chair I'd occupied the day before, but his expression shifted to confusion when I placed a sealed envelope on his desk. "Mrs. Coleman, what can I do for you?" I pushed the envelope toward him. "Harold asked me to give you this after yesterday's meeting. He was very specific about the timing." Morrison's brow furrowed as he opened the envelope. Inside was another will, this one dated just 6 weeks before Harold's death. I watched his face as he read, seeing his eyes widen slightly, then narrow, with professional concentration. "Mrs. Coleman," he said slowly, "this changes things significantly." "I know." He continued reading, occasionally glancing up at me as if trying to gauge my reaction. But I'd already read this document many times during those late nights when Harold couldn't sleep and we'd planned for this exact moment. According to this, Morrison said, Harold left everything to you. The house, the business, all properties, and accounts. Everything. I nodded. That's correct. But yesterday's will. Was the decoy? I said quietly. Harold wanted them to show their true colors first. He wanted to see how they'd treat me when they thought I was powerless. Morrison set the papers down and leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Coleman, I need to verify this document's authenticity, but if it's legitimate, and given the more recent date, this supersedes yesterday's reading entirely. It's legitimate. Harold had it prepared by Thomas Garrett downtown. You can call him if you need confirmation. 20 minutes later, Morrison had verified everything. The signatures were authentic, the witnesses were valid, and the date made this Harold's final and binding will. Morrison looked like a man who'd just discovered he'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. What would you like me to do? He asked. Call Robert. Tell him we need another family meeting. Today, if possible. 2 hours later, they were back in Morrison's office, looking annoyed at being summoned on such short notice. Robert had left work early, clearly irritated. Juniper kept checking her watch, and Lance looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. What's this about? Robert asked as they settled into their chairs. We just went through everything yesterday. Morrison cleared his throat. I'm afraid there's been a development. It seems Harold prepared a second will, one that supersedes the document we read yesterday. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Juniper sat forward in her chair, her perfectly manicured nails gripping the armrests. What do you mean, a second will? She asked. Morrison began reading, his voice steady and professional, but I watched their faces instead of listening to words I already knew by heart. Robert went pale first, his mouth opening slightly as he processed what he was hearing. Juniper's face shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching panic. Lance was the last to understand. Wait, what does this mean? It means, Morrison said, that your grandmother inherits everything. The house, the business, all properties and financial accounts go directly to Marlene Coleman. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the air conditioning humming, the muffled sound of traffic outside, the scratch of Morrison's pen as he made notes on his legal pad. Robert was the first to speak, his voice tight with controlled anger. This can't be right. Dad wouldn't have done this. The document is legitimate and properly witnessed, Morrison replied, and it's dated 6 weeks after the will we read yesterday, making it Harold's final testament. Juniper's face had gone from pale to flushed. There has to be some mistake. Harold promised Robert the business. We've been planning. She stopped herself, but it was too late. The truth was out. They'd been planning my future based on money they'd never actually been promised. Planning what? I asked quietly. For the first time since we'd entered the office, they all looked directly at me. Really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time in years. Mom? Robert said, his voice strained. Surely you understand this puts everyone in a difficult position. Does it? Lance had found his voice. Grandma, you can't possibly want to run a construction business. You don't know anything about it. I almost smiled at that. Lance, who'd never worked a day in his life, explaining business to me. You'd be surprised what I know. But the house, Juniper said, her voice rising slightly. You said yourself it's too big for one person. I said, I'd consider my options. I didn't say I'd reached any conclusions. Morrison was watching this exchange with the careful attention of a lawyer who sensed trouble brewing. Perhaps we should schedule another meeting to discuss the practical implications. No, I said firmly. I think we've covered everything we need to cover today. I stood up, and the room seemed to shift around me. Suddenly, I wasn't the frail widow they'd been making plans for. I was the woman who now controlled everything they'd thought was theirs. Robert stood as well, his face showing a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like fear. "Mom, we need to talk about this as a family." We just did. Juniper was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "Marlene, surely you're not going to let this misunderstanding tear the family apart." I picked up my purse and Harold's briefcase, feeling their eyes following my every movement. Harold knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote this will. He knew what you really thought of me, how you talked about me when you thought I couldn't hear. The color drained from Juniper's face. Lance looked confused, but Robert's expression told me he was beginning to understand. "He heard you discussing senior communities at his own breakfast table," I continued. "He heard you planning which room Lance would take after I was gone. He heard every whispered conversation about what an inconvenience I'd become." I moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at them one more time. Harold spent 47 years watching me be overlooked, dismissed, and treated like I was invisible. This will isn't just about money. It's about respect. Something you never thought I deserved. I left them there in Morrison's office, stunned and silent, finally understanding that the quiet woman they'd taken for granted had just inherited everything they'd assumed was theirs. They followed me home. I saw Robert's SUV in my rearview mirror as I pulled into the driveway, with Juniper's car right behind him. By the time I'd unlocked my front door, they were standing on my porch, their faces showing a mixture of desperation and barely contained anger. "Mom, we need to talk," Robert said as I stepped inside. They followed without invitation, filling my living room with their presence and their panic. I set Harold's briefcase on the coffee table and sat in my usual chair, the one where I'd spent countless evenings watching television while they made plans around me. They remained standing, as if sitting would somehow acknowledge that this was now my house by right, not just by marriage. "This is insane," Juniper said, pacing behind the couch. Harold was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. People make irrational decisions when they're dying. "Harold's mind was perfectly clear," I replied. The doctor confirmed that right up until the end. Lance was examining the room as if seeing it for the first time, probably calculating what everything was worth. "But Grandma, you don't understand. Business. The construction company needs someone who knows what they're doing." I looked at my grandson, this young man who'd never held a job for longer than 3 months, explaining business management to me. "I've been doing the books for that company for 15 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, then something close to shock. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. "I mean, I've been handling the accounting, payroll, tax preparations, and client billing since 2008. Every night. After dinner, Harold would bring me the paperwork. Every morning I'd have it organized and ready for him to take to the office." Juniper stopped pacing. "That's impossible." Harold never mentioned a lot of things, I said, like the fact that I suggested bidding on the Morrison Shopping Center project that brought in your biggest contract last year, or that I was the one who noticed the error in the Peterson invoice that saved the company $12,000. Robert sank onto the couch, his face pale. "Why, didn't you ever say anything? When would I have said it? During the family dinners where you discussed my future like I wasn't there? During the conversations where you decided I was too old to understand modern life?" I stood up and walked to Harold's desk in the corner of the room, opening the bottom drawer. Inside were files I'd organized, spreadsheets I'd created, correspondence I'd handled. I pulled out a thick folder and set it on the coffee table. "This is the real financial picture of Harold's business," I said. "Not just the construction company you know about, but the investment portfolio I helped him build, the real estate ventures I researched, the savings accounts I managed." Juniper grabbed the folder with shaking hands. flipping through pages of documents. Her face grew paler with each page she turned. "This can't be right," she whispered. "These numbers are accurate," I finished. "Harold was worth considerably, more than any of you realized. And now, according to his will, it's all mine." Lance had found his voice again. "But what are you going to do with it? You're 70 years old." For the first time since this conversation began, I smiled. "I'm going to live, Lance. Really live, for the first time in years." Robert leaned forward, his business mind finally engaging. "Mom, be reasonable. The construction company alone requires daily management. You can't possibly handle all of this alone." "You're right," I said. "I can't handle it alone. That's why I'll be hiring a management company. Professional people who understand business and won't treat me like I'm in the way." "You're going to hire strangers instead of keeping it in the family?" Juniper's voice was shrill now, her composure completely gone. I looked at her. This woman, who'd whispered about burying me with my husband just 3 days ago. "Family? When have any of you treated me like family?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Robert opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. What could he say? That they'd included me in their plans? They had. As an obligation to be managed? Not as a person to be respected. "We always." He started, then stopped. "Always what? Always took care of me? Always considered my feelings? Always treated me as an equal member of this family?" I walked to the mantel where our family photos sat, picking up one from Lance's high school graduation. In the picture, Robert, Juniper, and Lance stood together, smiling. Harold and I stood slightly apart, like afterthoughts included out of politeness. "This photo tells the real story," I said, holding it up. "You've always been a family of 3, tolerating the 2 old people who happen to share your last name." "That's not true," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? When was the last time any of you asked about my interests, my thoughts, my dreams? When was the last time you included me in a decision that affected my own life?" They had no answer because there was no answer. For years, I'd been a background character in my own family's story, present but not participating, seen but not heard. "Harold knew," I continued. "He watched you dismiss me, ignore me, plan around me. He heard Juniper call me a burden. He saw Lance treat me like I was already gone. And he decided to do something about it." Juniper was crying now, mascara streaming down her cheeks. "But what about us? What about Lance's future? What about Robert's plans for the business?" I set the photo back on the mantel and turned to face them. "What about them? When did any of you consider my future? When did you ask what I wanted or needed or hoped for?" "We were going to take care of you," Robert said desperately. "Take care of me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You were going to warehouse me in the cheapest facility you could find while you divided up everything Harold and I had built together." The truth was out now, hanging between us like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. They had shown me exactly what they thought I was worth, and Harold had responded by showing them what I was actually worth. "So what happens now?" Lance asked, his voice small. I looked at my family. My son who'd never defended me, my daughter-in-law who'd never respected, me, my grandson who'd never really seen me, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete and total freedom. "Now," I said quietly, "you're going to learn what it feels like to be treated the way you treated me." The phone calls started the next morning. Robert called first, his voice carefully controlled, asking if we could meet for lunch to discuss the situation reasonably. I declined politely and hung up. Juniper called 20 minutes later, her tone syrupy sweet, wondering if I'd like to go shopping together, just us girls. I told her I was busy and ended the call. Lance sent a text asking if he could borrow money for his car payment. I didn't respond. By the end of the week, their approach had shifted from friendly to desperate. Robert showed up at my door with flowers, apologizing for any misunderstandings and suggesting we work together to honor Dad's memory. I accepted the flowers graciously and told him I'd already made my decisions. Those decisions had been forming in my mind since the day Harold first showed me his real will. We'd talked about it during those long nights when his pain medication made him restless and philosophical. "They think I'm just the old man who pays the bills," he'd said one evening, propped up against his pillows. "They think you're just the old woman who cooks the meals and stays out of the way." "We've been invisible for years," I'd agreed. "Then, let's see how they handle it when we're the only ones who matter." Now, sitting in Morrison's office again, I signed the papers that would make Harold's vision reality. The construction business would be sold to Harold's longtime foreman, Jim Peterson, who'd been running the day-to-day operations anyway. Jim had the experience and respected Harold's work. More importantly, he'd always treated me with courtesy. "The sale price is fair," Morrison explained as I signed. "Peterson's offering above market value because he wants to keep all the current employees." I nodded. Harold would have approved. He'd always cared more about his workers than his profits. "What?" "About the rental properties," Morrison asked. "Keep them. I'll hire a management company to handle the day-to-day operations. And the investment accounts?" "Transfer them to my personal portfolio. I'll be making some changes." Those changes included selling Robert's house, the one Harold had bought for him and Juniper as a wedding gift 15 years ago, the one they'd assumed was theirs, but had never been transferred out of Harold's name. Legally, it was part of the estate, which meant it was now mine. I gave them 30 days' notice, delivered by Morrison in a formal letter that explained their options: buy the house at market value or find somewhere else to live. Robert called. Within an hour of receiving the letter, his voice shaking with anger. "Mom, you can't be serious. This is our home. Lance grew up here." "It's Harold's house," I corrected, "and now it's mine. If you'd like to purchase it, I'm sure Morrison can. Arrange financing." "We can't afford to buy it. You know that." "Then you'll need to find somewhere else to live." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Finally, his voice came through, smaller and more defeated than I'd ever heard it. "Why are you doing this to us?" I thought about that question for a long moment, remembering all the times I'd asked myself the same thing about their treatment of me. "I'm not doing anything to you, Robert. I'm simply doing what I need to do for myself." "But we're family." "Yes," I said quietly. "We are, and families should treat each other with respect and kindness. Perhaps this will help you remember that." The next few weeks brought a parade of increasingly desperate attempts to change my mind. Juniper came by with photo albums, trying to evoke memories of happier times. Lance wrote me a letter apologizing for taking me for granted, promising to do better if I'd reconsider. Robert tried a different approach, bringing his accountant to show me how much money I'd lose by selling the business instead of keeping it in the family. When I remained unmoved, he brought his lawyer, who explained that I could be challenged on grounds of diminished capacity. "Mrs. Coleman," the lawyer said, "your family is concerned that you're not making rational decisions during your grief period." I smiled at him across my kitchen table. "Mr. Davidson, I've been making rational decisions for 70 years. The only difference now is that I'm making them for myself instead of around everyone else's needs." 2 days later, Morrison called to tell me that Robert had attempted to contest the will. "He's claiming Harold was unduly influenced," Morrison explained. "But the medical records show your husband was competent, and the witnesses to the will are unimpeachable." "How long will this take?" "A few months, maybe longer. But Robert's case is weak. This appears to be more about desperation than legitimate legal grounds." I wasn't surprised. Desperate people do desperate things, and Robert was watching his assumptions about his future crumble around him. The house sold quickly. I'd priced it fairly, and it was in a good neighborhood. Robert and Juniper were forced to find a small apartment across town, something they could afford on Robert's salary from his new job. He'd found work with a competing construction company, but at a much lower position than he'd expected to inherit. Lance moved back in with them, sleeping on their couch because they couldn't afford a 3-bedroom apartment. I heard about their situation through the neighbors, who seemed to think I should feel guilty about my family's reduced circumstances. I didn't feel guilty. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. For the first time since Harold's death, I could sit in my living room without wondering when someone would decide I needed to be moved somewhere else. I could make plans for my future without consulting people who saw me as an obligation rather than a person. The phone calls had stopped. The surprise visits had ended. My family had finally learned what I'd known for years. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones who hurt you the most. But I wasn't finished yet. There was still one more decision to make, one final choice that would determine not just my future, but the lesson my family would ultimately learn from their treatment of me. Harold had trusted me with his legacy. Now it was time to decide what that legacy would actually mean. 6 months after Harold's funeral, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, making coffee in a routine that was entirely my own. The townhouse was smaller than the family home I'd shared with Harold, but every corner of it reflected my choices, my preferences, my life. Through the window, I could see the garden I'd planted, roses and lavender, the flowers I'd always loved, but never had space for in Harold's carefully maintained landscape. The morning sun caught the petals, making them glow like jewels in the soft light. I'd sold the old house 3 months ago, not because I couldn't afford to keep it, but because I no longer wanted to live surrounded by memories of feeling invisible. The new owners were a young couple with 2 small children who saw it as a dream home rather than a monument to obligation. With the sale, I'd had enough money to buy this place outright and still have more left over than I'd ever imagined possible. Harold's investments had grown substantially over the years, carefully tended by both of us in ways our family never suspected. The doorbell rang as I was settling into my favorite chair with my coffee and the morning newspaper. I opened it to find Robert standing on my porch, looking older than his 52 years. His clothes were neat but showed signs of wear, and there was something different in his posture. Less certainty, more humility. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I stepped aside to let him in. He looked around the townhouse, taking in the comfortable furniture, the family photos I'd chosen to keep, the evidence of a life that was flourishing rather than merely surviving. "You look good," he said, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. "I feel good." We sat in my living room, and for the first time in years, the silence between us wasn't filled with tension. It was simply quiet, the kind of pause that comes before important conversations. "I've been thinking," Robert said finally, "about everything that's happened, about the things we said, the way we treated you." I waited. I'd learned the value of letting people find their own words. "We were wrong," he continued, his voice steady but pained. "Not just about the money, but about you, about what you meant to Dad, what you contributed, who you are." "What made you realize that?" He laughed, but it was a sound without humor. Living in a 2-bedroom apartment with my wife and adult son, working for someone else after thinking I'd inherit a business, watching Juniper try to budget groceries for the first time in her life. He paused, running his hands through his hair. But mostly, it was talking to Jim Peterson. Jim Peterson, Harold's former foreman who'd bought the construction business. I'd wondered if their paths would cross. "Jim told me about the work you did," Robert continued. "All those years of bookkeeping, the suggestions you made, the problems you solved. He said Dad always called you his secret weapon, that half the company's success was due to your input." I sipped my coffee, remembering those evenings at the kitchen table. Harold spreading out invoices and contracts while I organized them into systems that made sense. "We never knew," Robert said. "Dad never told us." Would you have listened if he had? The question hung between us. We both knew the answer. Robert looked around my living room again, taking in the photographs I'd displayed, some family pictures, but also images from my recent travels, certificates from classes I'd taken, evidence of a life that extended far beyond the role of dutiful wife and ignored mother. "You've been busy," he observed. "I've been living. Over the past 6 months, I'd done things I'd dreamed about for years but never pursued. I'd taken a photography class and discovered I had an eye for composition. I'd joined a book club and made friends who knew me as Marlene, not as someone's wife or mother. I'd traveled to places Harold and I had talked about visiting but never made time for." "Are you happy?" Robert asked. The question surprised me with its directness. "Yes. For the first time in years, I'm genuinely happy." "I'm glad," he said, and I could tell he meant it. "I'm also sorry. We should have been part of that happiness instead of obstacles to it." I studied my son's face, seeing not the entitled man who'd taken my inheritance for granted, but the confused boy he'd once been, trying to navigate a world that had taught him the wrong lessons about family and value. "Robert," I said gently, "I didn't do any of this to punish you. I did it to save myself." "I know that now." We talked for another hour, not about money or property or the past, but about our lives, as they were now. Robert told me about his new job, how he was learning to appreciate working for someone who valued his skills rather than his last name. He talked about Juniper, who was working part-time at a boutique and discovering she actually enjoyed the independence. "And Lance?" I asked. Robert's expression tightened slightly. "Lance is adjusting. Living with us has been an eye-opener for him. He's finally looking for steady work." When Robert left, he hugged me at the door, the first genuine embrace we'd shared in years. "Will you come to dinner sometime?" he asked. "Nothing fancy, just family dinner." "I'd like that," I said, and realized I meant it. After he left, I returned to my coffee and newspaper, but found myself looking out at my garden instead of reading. The roses were blooming beautifully, their petals soft and full in the morning light. My phone rang, Margaret from my book club, calling to confirm our lunch plans. After that, I had a photography workshop in the afternoon and dinner with new friends in the evening. My calendar was full these days, but with activities I'd chosen, people who saw me clearly, experiences that fed my soul rather than drained it. I thought about Harold, about the gift he'd given me with his final will. Not just the money, though that had provided security and options. The real gift had been the permission to value myself, to understand that respect isn't something you earn through endless sacrifice, but something you claim by refusing to accept less than you deserve. The family that had dismissed me was learning to see me differently, but more importantly, I was learning to see myself clearly. I was Marlene Coleman, not just Harold's widow or Robert's mother or Lance's grandmother. I was a woman with interests and talents and dreams, a person whose thoughts and feelings and choices mattered. The woman who should have been buried with her husband was very much alive, perhaps for the first time in years. And that, I thought as I returned to my coffee and the quiet satisfaction of my own company, was the greatest inheritance of all. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.